What's up, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. We're going to be breaking down UFC Fight Night, Dern versus Xiaonan. But first, I want to talk about something like, not really MMA related, but in a way it kind of is because it's related to head trauma, right? And that's the situation with Tua Tagovailoa and the Miami Dolphins last night against the Cincinnati Bengals, right? So, for those of you who don't know, Tua Tagovailoa is the quarterback for the Miami Dolphins. And last night, he got hit pretty hard, right? Slammed to the ground, kind of came down on like his elbow, his shoulder, and his head at the same time. Reaches over, kind of curls up, grabs his head, and then he goes into what we call like posturing, right? Which is, according to Brian Studer, I believe he's an MD on YouTube. Like, I'll put a link to his video in the thing explaining what happened. Like, he can explain it much more eloquently than I can. But a lot of people are saying it was the fencing pose. He says it's similar. Either way, his fingers are all like fucked up and extended and like pointing in these directions and kind of frozen there, right? So everybody's obviously always concerned, or very concerned, but you dig a little bit deeper into this and you start finding out like, okay, on Sunday in his game against the Buffalo Bills, and for anyone who witnessed this happening, like, it was scary, and you knew that he should not be playing this week against the Cincinnati Bengals if you are a fan of fighting and saw this, right? Because you're familiar with the fact that when people get knocked out, you don't let them play 4 days later, right? Okay, so the injury that Tua sustained on Sunday against the Bills was he was kind of like, I think he was delivering a pass and then the guy shoved him and he came down on his back, but when he came down, he wham, like got whiplash and smacked the back of his helmet off the turf, right? So chin didn't stay tucked, boom, whiplash. Back of the head hits the turf. He stands up, kind of shakes his head a little bit and like looks like he's like doesn't have good footing underneath him and then stumbles and like collapses to a knee. What does that sound like to you? Head trauma. Even if this guy is telling you, and I don't know like all the reports and stuff, but supposedly, right, he's cleared by an independent doctor or whatever, not a team doctor. He's cleared and he's good to play. And according to like a bunch of different people talking and saying stuff, I don't know for sure. They're saying it's because Tua said it was his neck and his spine and he cleared the concussion protocol. But it doesn't take a fucking genius to tell you that Tua suffered from head trauma on Sunday. The way he stood up, I mean, it's reminiscent of when a guy gets knocked out in the UFC or in MMA, and he's trying to convince the ref that he's still okay as he's walking around the octagon, like falling to his knees, and he doesn't have control of his extremities completely, right? Like, he's moving, but they're not doing what he wants, and they're not responding, and he's clearly not all with it, even though he seems to be there consciously. I feel like that's what happened to Tua on Sunday versus the Bills. He essentially got TK fucking O'd, right? Like, if that had been in a fight, the fight would have been stopped based on the way he was acting and stuff like that, right? Like, that's what it really reminded me of. Then you say, okay, I don't know how you don't look at that and say, okay, we're going to let this kid play 4 days later. Even if you're not positive and you don't think and he clears all this bullshit percussion, whatever it is, like it doesn't matter. It's very obvious that he should not be playing in a game 4 days later. You just take precautionary measures. When a guy gets knocked out in the UFC, it's not uncommon to see them suspended for 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, 45 days, no contact. Like, things like that get handed down frequently. And when you're talking about an NFL quarterback, guys, you are talking about a guy who is taught to hold on to the football with two hands most of the times. You hear Gruden talk about this, right? Because of the risk of fumbling and stuff. And he's running around in the pocket, escaping from 300-plus pound behemoths or linebackers who are running at him and blitzing him who weigh 250, 260 pounds and run 4.5 40s, right? All the while, he doesn't have a means of really defending himself. Okay? So you're asking this guy who has to release a football and put his body in a vulnerable position no matter what. You're asking him to go out and play after exhibiting signs of what most people would consider to be like at least a concussion. It makes no sense. And in situations like this, even if they're passing concussion protocol, you should just be able to look at what happened and say, okay, it doesn't matter. He exhibited some signs that are pretty like in line with what we see head trauma victims go through. We're going to make him rest for like 3 weeks minimum and then let him come back in week 4 because at least something like that, right? Something more extreme than like what happened here, because like at the end of the day, you're talking about not this kid's career, you're talking about his life, right? And those are the kind of hits that take years off of your life and stuff like that. And it's like, oh, I hate to say that, and I hope that's not the case, right? But it really is. And the fact that you saw this response from him where he goes into like this posturing, right? And his fingers are all weird. You see this probably because he is taking consistent damage, right? Like he just took damage on Sunday and then the follow-up, right? Even when you see knockouts, and granted, you don't always know what people go through in the UFC, right? Like maybe in camp they were like getting head trauma over and over and over again, training through it, and then they finally get to the fight, get hit with a clean shot, get knocked out. Who knows? But like an example that I think of is Aljamain Sterling versus Marlon Moraes when he got caught and he goes like arm stiff, right? That's what it reminded me of. But even in a situation like that, that's a flash knockout, and it's fighting, and it's part of the sport, and both guys are defending themselves, right? Now, I'm not saying that the players aren't aware of the risks of playing football. It's a dangerous sport, and like we just talked about all of the things that like could happen to you as a cornerback. You're in vulnerable positions a lot, like playing against really big guys. That's not what I'm upset about. You're allowed to take these risks on. You know that this is a possibility. But this wasn't like a flash knockout or a one-instance thing. This was, you had a kid on Sunday who very clearly showed signs of head trauma, regardless of what you want to say about his neck and his spine. I'm so tired of hearing that shit. He showed signs of head trauma, and then he played on Thursday night. And then you got to go a little bit deeper and wonder, like, if he played a worse team other than the Bengals, which isn't a big conference game, right? Are we looking at this a little bit differently, and did he get to sit? It's crazy. He should have never played, and in my opinion, should have been out for a minimum 2 weeks. Minimum 2. I really like more like 3 or 4 because, like I said, you're talking about 3 or 4 games and this kid's entire career. And then his life after that, right? So it's like, to see him go through that was just rough because if you leave it up to him, of course he's going to say he wants to play. It's like guys like Brian Ortega who are just too tough for their own good, and when they're losing, they'll continue to take punishment if you let them. We'll talk about another example of this in Thomas Gifford versus Mike Davis when we break that fight down. But damn, man, it's like, just do the right thing. Pull him out. This is an easy decision. It should have never been a fucking question. It shouldn't have been a controversy. Tua shouldn't have been, especially, and you think about this. I know I'm talking about like football a lot here, but like, think about the fact that Teddy Bridgewater is your backup. Like, you have a competent backup quarterback, and you're risking this guy's health for what? A victory? And then look at what happened. I mean, Jesus Christ. It's not rocket science. Anybody who watched that hit, even just a regular fan, would have told you like, I wouldn't play him this week. Of course he wouldn't, because you have fucking common sense and these people don't. Unreal. Anyway, let's move on and talk about Bo Nickal, because a lot of people are excited about Bo Nickal, and admittedly so am I. If you watch his performance against Donovan Beard, and I can't even remember the name of the guy he fought. I'm sorry. The guy he fought first on the Contender Series, he's blown through 2 straight opponents in a show that's pretty tough, man. Like, it is a pretty tough show. And it's a show that really promotes, like, knockouts and finishes and stuff like that. And you got to see that Bo Nickal kind of has that quality about him, right? And, like, we're immediately, especially because they're in the same weight class, right? Like, well, at least, Khamzat flirts between 170 and 185. But there are a lot of comparisons to be made here, right? Like, the limited amount of experience, right? He's only 3-0, including his Dana White Contender Series wins. Khamzat Chimaev came into the UFC, I believe, at like maybe 6-0, 7-0 perhaps, and like was blitzing through competition there and getting finishes quickly, right? And that's exactly what Bo Nickal has done when we've seen him fight so far. Now, you hear about him calling out Khamzat and all this stuff, right? And I personally think that's a little bit overblown. Think about the fact that Khamzat just fought Kevin Holland. Khamzat has fought Gilbert Burns. Khamzat has fought Gerald Meerschaert, right? Like, he went through fighting the lower end of the UFC talent pool and then worked his way up, admittedly rather quickly, got that kind of like Cody Garbrandt, Alex Pereira type trajectory, right? But it's because when you watch him just keep blitzing through people like Li Jingliang, you're like, all right, you just keep advancing him that same way. And that's what you do with Bo Nickal, in my opinion. Right? Don't get me wrong. The triangle that he hit and everything, the way he threw the overhand left and was immediately scooping behind the leg to set up his takedown, the way he got to mount, his recognition and his willingness and his confidence to roll to his back to get that finish, all super impressive. But my point is just that Khamzat, at this point in his career, has seen higher level opponents and has also seen more responses, right? Like, if you look at the Kevin Holland breakdown I just did, there are a lot of moments in that fight where Khamzat Chimaev had to deal with adversity and had to deal with Kevin Holland putting up these like really nuanced defenses, right? Granted, he tried the Granby roll the same. He tried it 3 different times, right? But the point is just that, like, Khamzat seems to have an answer for all of these different threats or escape attempts that you might pose against him. Whereas we haven't really seen anybody put up that sort of resistance yet against Bo Nickal. So that's why Dana White's completely right. You have to put him in, and you have to make sure that you build him up correctly and that you don't just immediately throw him the top 15 talent. You put him on the Khamzat track. Put him against guys at the lower end of the talent pool. No offense to Jamie Pickett, but guys who aren't in that top 15 range. Let him fight another person after that. Start thinking about top 15, 10, 5, boom. And if he keeps accelerating through those in the way that Khamzat did, then there you go, right? He's on the right track. But, like, you have to make sure you handle this correctly and don't feed him to people too early, because it's very important to gain octagon time and just to gain experience and to get into situations where you're not blitzing through your opponent like you thought you might, like we saw Khamzat versus Gilbert Burns. And Khamzat really blew through Kevin Holland too. What he did was incredible, but, like, there were just moments where Holland was able to, like, throw up some defenses and make Khamzat work to get the takedowns a little bit more, right? So that's my only point. We got to develop this guy and see what happens. And is there potential for Khamzat and Bo Nickal to meet down the road? Absolutely, I think there is. But we got to let Bo Nickal polish up his game a little bit before we start talking about that. My personal opinion. All right, guys. So let's start breaking this main card down a little bit, right? And obviously the fights this weekend are headlined by Mackenzie Dern and Xiaonan. And number 5 and number 6 in the world, both in the women's strawweight division, right? But we got a pretty good card on our hands. But honestly, there's a lot of favorites on the card, and there's a lot of favorites that I agree with and that I think are well warranted, right? One interesting thing about this is that apparently it's like a private event. There's no media allowed, there's no fans allowed, and during the press conference leading up to the fight, Mackenzie Dern said that Mark Zuckerberg rented it out. And then I saw a tweet somewhere that said, like, kind of confirming that, but said that he was testing out his VR glasses so that you could wear these glasses and then watch the fights from your living room, basically, but feel like you're there, which I really think is the future of sports. And it does kind of seem to be the direction that Facebook's moving in. I mean, if you listen to Zuckerberg on Joe Rogan's podcast, he talked about these glasses and stuff. So, like, we are moving in that direction, and if that's fucking true, that's awesome. But Dana White put out a tweet and said it's total bullshit, so who knows what's going on. But it is like a private event, which I found interesting, but I don't know. It would make a lot more sense if it really was because of those VR glasses. But anyway, we're going to start, and don't forget, guys, we got some pretty good prelims, right? Like, headlining the prelims is Zalir Latifi and Alexei Oleinik. That's a good fight. Jessica Penne, Tabitha Ricci, Joaquim Silva versus Jesse Ronson. We got some Christoph Jatkos fighting Brendan Allen on the prelims. That's a great fight. Felipe Lins versus Maxim Grishin. Like, there's some good fights on the prelims, but we're going to start breaking the actual fights down here with the first one on the main card. And it's a lightweight bout, and we're opening up with Mike Davis versus Slava Borschev. Now, Mike Davis is a guy who, if you watch him fight, he can fucking crack. He punches really, really hard, and he also strings together his combinations pretty well, and he's a really good boxer, right? So he has a lot of power, and I think personally his best combination is when he goes right hook to the body and the left hand comes over top. He lands that consistently in almost all of his fights, and I really like, and what I think a difference maker in this fight might be, is the timing on his takedowns. This fight always makes me think about how many different elements there are to MMA, right? Because, like, with Mike Davis, he's a really good boxer. He's not afraid to get in your face. He can crack, right? He's got all these different things going. And because he's so good on the feet, it opens up these takedown opportunities for him because guys want to trade with him, right? Maybe get one back, and he catches them overextending a little bit. And his timing is really good. Like, he takes explosive shots in the center of the octagon. However, when he gets there, there's another element of fighting in MMA, and that's control. And that's where you see guys like Khabib or Masters, right? His control isn't quite there yet, and his passing isn't quite there. But a big difference maker in this matchup might be just the fact that he's able to change levels like that. Because Slava Borschev, while he's a very talented and a very gifted striker, I don't think you're going to see him being offensive with the takedowns in this fight, right? He's got to be able to fend off takedowns of Mike Davis. And in my opinion, try to, like, you know, not eat those big shots. Obviously, I mean, that sounds fucking obvious, right? But he's got to be able to counter well because Davis is going to fight aggressive, right? So he has to be able to play the counter game. And then he's got to be preemptive about the shots that Mike Davis might take, especially if Borschev is a successful landing. If Davis is able to successfully implement the takedowns and just introduce, like I said, His control might not be that great, but if he's just able to introduce this idea that, hey, I can put the fight here when I want to, even if Slava gets up, that's work for Slava, and it looks good on the judges' scorecards. So, something that Slava Borschev can take advantage of if he's able to fend off these takedowns, and we saw this in a little bit with Mike Davis in the fight against Mason Jones. He's a little bit slow off the break. So if Slava can fend things off and start tagging him in those moments after the clinch breaks or after the takedown's fended off and Davis is on his way up, he might be able to find some success, because you've seen in a couple fights now that like Davis gets quite literally beat to the punch there sometimes. So keys to victory for Slava Borschev are going to have to be staying out of the way of the danger of Davis and timing so that he can counter, because Davis is going to come forward and box you. I also think that Slava should implement a pretty kick-heavy approach, right? We see Davis go to the legs fairly often, but I feel like if Slava starts implementing that game plan against him, beating his legs up, countering, he might be able to find avenues of success. However, I'm taking Mike Davis in this fight. I really like his experience. I like how hard he hits. I like his like nice, compact, tight boxing style. I like his head movement. I like him to be a little bit better and more explosive than Borschev on the feet. And just the ability to mix those takedowns. I think that like can be a difference maker and just get your opponent's head thinking a little bit more about like, okay, what's he going to do next? I like all those things for Mike Davis, and I think he takes this fight. I could see this being, though, a very competitive fight, and one where it's going to stay on the feet, and you might finally, not finally, Slava picked up a win in his UFC debut, right? He hit a liver shot and got the knockout, but like, you might get to see a chance for Slava Borschev to really shine in this fight, because Mike Davis does like to stand and bang. I think Davis just has an advantage, like I said, with some of those punches. But, man, don't sleep on Slava Borschev. He can crack, and another thing is he likes to fucking fight too. You might get a real firefight in this one. This has potential, I think, to be fight of the night. So don't count Slava Borschev out, but I am going with Mike Davis. I think he just has a little bit more tools in the toolbox. I think I like his style a little bit more, but I think Slava's dangerous, man. And if he can get the counters going, slide out of range, I think he has a chance in this one. But I'm taking Mike Davis. I'm not sure on the method. I could see it going the distance. I could see these guys getting in a war. I could see somebody getting knocked out. Too many different directions for it to go, but I do think it'll be a great fight. All right, moving on to John Castaneda versus Daniel Santos. And this is saying that this is actually a catchweight bout on the UFC website, so I haven't checked, but I wonder if one of them missed weight. Interesting. Either way, these guys normally fight at bantamweight. And John Castaneda is a guy who really, I think, does his best work when he's pressure boxing, right? And he has this kind of like weird, you saw it against Eddie Wineland and some other folks too that he's fought, but like he almost like karate blitzes you, but you know how Machida's going with like straight punches when he does his? Castaneda's almost throwing like boxing combinations while he's like blitzing you. And it's interesting and it works, man. He finds home with it a lot. He's also a pretty good wrestler. I believe he wrestled up through his freshman year in college, so he has experience there. And he can like put the fight in different areas, which I think will be a big deal against Daniel Santos, who's a guy who recently fought Julio Arce, right? And just kind of got pieced up because he was coming forward. He loads up on his shots really big and he throws a lot of power. But man, he's just kind of coming at you with that like kind of like fuck it style. He's not moving his head a whole lot. He's just marching you down, throwing big shots, and he just throws with a lot of intensity. And it's very reminiscent of that like Muay Thai style, right? He does very well. Generally, Arce was able to exploit some stuff with his patience and just being a crafty veteran, right? But he does well when he's moving forward, and he does have a lot of power. He's not quite a few people out, and I kind of think the odds makers are sleeping on Santos a little bit in this fight. I think it's going to be very hard for Castaneda to catch Santos with something that hurts him, but I think Santos has a good chance to catch Castaneda with something. I overall think that Castaneda just has the slicker head movement. I think he's going to be able to change levels and get this fight to the ground, and Santos with that like sort of Muay Thai stance might not be prepared for some of those takedown attempts that Castaneda mixes in. I think Castaneda, like I said, the head movement, the boxing will start opening up the wrestling, and there's more places that he can take this fight. But if he lets Santos start marching him down and Santos starts finding home and connecting, Santos is a violent motherfucker, man. And I actually, while I'm taking Castaneda to win this fight, like I said, I like almost all the favorites in this, if that's a spoiler for any of you guys. But I'm putting money on Santos in this fight, I think. I just think the odds, let me check what they are. I'll see if I can pull them up on DraftKings here. But I just think that the odds are like too far skewed in Castaneda's favor, because Santos is going to march you down. And like I said, if he can cut angles well and kind of keep this fight up against the octagon and kind of keep Castaneda pushed behind that black line. And I think the fact that Castaneda moves a little bit more around, like he uses a little more lateral movement, whereas Santos pushes forward, I think Santos will have the edge in like octagon control. It's just going to be, can he cut him off and keep getting the angles that he needs to land those big blows? If not, Castaneda's probably going to take the fight because his head movement and stuff will probably win out, right? It's going to be interesting. But I think Santos, let me see if I can find the fucking odds. Here we go. Santos is a plus 155 dog, man. And to me, I think that's worth the money. So I got Castaneda to win, but I like the money on Santos just because I think the odds should be a little bit more even for this. All right, next, a fight where the odds are not even at all. Number 12 ranked Sodiq Yusuff is going up against Don Shainis. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, nicknamed Shameless. But either way, this is his UFC debut. And I've looked back through some of his fights, and really where he gets a lot of his like wins are like one fight, for example, a guy came out and like threw a flying kick and he was wild right off the bat, right? Don was able to catch it, get to the ground eventually, and he gets to these positions where he does advance through people's guard very well, right? And he gets to these positions where he's able to ground and pound until he picks up the victory. I don't think that's going to work against Sodiq Yusuff. I just think Sodiq Yusuff has seen too much high-level competition. He's going to be very composed. And Don Shainis, while he thinks that he might be able to make this like a gritty, grindy type of fight, I think that Sodiq Yusuff is too technical on the feet for Shainis to ever sort of even turn this into a brawl. Also, Sodiq Yusuff is good everywhere, man. I mean, like, I think he's like top 5 potential at some point in his career. If he can keep on, I love the way he strikes, right? He's willing to stand he's willing to stand and bang for sure, but he's also a great wrestler. And like one thing we were talking about Mike Davis, right? And how he gets to the takedown, but he doesn't really have great control. When Sodiq Yusuff gets to the takedown, he immediately starts controlling ankles and stuff if they're in open guard, pressuring them down and advancing through people's guard and getting to really advantageous positions, right? Also, we've seen him get into situations where he's been in trouble on the ground and he always remains defensively responsible, right? He has very good defensive jiu-jitsu, and I just don't see a lot of situations where Don Shainis is going to be able to get this anywhere to start to threaten Sodiq Yusuff. Even if he does somehow manage to get on top of Sodiq and get into like a good position and you're like, oh, this is interesting, I think Sodiq is always just going to be able to counter defensively, get back to top, and just do what he needs to do. I don't really see a single area where Don Shainis is going to be able to like beat Sodiq Yusuff. And even if he is able to make this, I mean, it's a fight and you're talking about 2 human beings. I don't want to discount anybody, but if I'm just looking like at this matchup technically, Sodiq Yusuff is better everywhere and he should get the finish, right? Either by submission or knockout. I think he can beat this guy on the feet, and I think he can beat him on the ground as well. I think Sodiq Yusuff is better from the bottom than Don Shainis is from the top, and I think that Sodiq is going to be much better on the top than Shainis is on the bottom. So, my personal opinion, I think there's a lot of holes in this game. And it's his UFC debut, man. Like, Yusuff has been here. He's done it. And he's taking this fight on such short notice because his original fight with Giga Chikadze a week or 2 ago was scrapped, right? It was canceled because Giga pulled out. I think he was injured. So Sodiq said, yes, I'll take this promotional newcomer. And think about it. When guys start, like when you go through a whole training camp, you do want to see like some of the fruits of your labor. And also another thing is like, everybody always talks about how important it is to stay active and get octagon time and how bad it is when you've had like layoffs and stuff like that, right? So for Sodiq to stay active, man, is he going to go in and whoop this dude's ass? Yeah, probably. I'd say there's like a 95% chance that happens. But, I mean, I don't blame him for wanting to get in there and keep mixing it up. You know, it's important. So I think it's a good move on his part to keep this fight. All right, moving on. We have another bantamweight matchup. And how stacked is the bantamweight division right now? I mean, Song Yadong versus Corey Sandhagen. That was a great fight a few weeks ago. Showed you the talent there, right? Like, we all knew how good Corey Sandhagen was, but I was really impressed with Song Yadong, to be honest. Sean O'Malley's fighting Petr Yan. Aljamain Sterling versus Dillashaw. I mean, 135, there's a good argument that it probably is the deepest division in the UFC right now. I think it's kind of surpassed lightweight. And guys like Raoni Barcelos are exactly the reason why. I like to think when I watch Raoni fight, at least like my impression of him is he's like a pressure counter fighter. He likes to apply pressure to you, but he really likes to feel things out with the jab and the front kick. And when he gets responses out of you, that's when he fires, right? And I think that's why you saw him start to struggle a little bit against Victor Henry. In the fight against Victor Henry, he started off very hot, but then Henry started following up and kept following up with the strikes. And I think that normally when Raoni's like, when he gets that response out of you and he counters and starts teeing off on you, it breaks up your rhythm. Right? And then it makes guys try to want to keep getting it back, and then he just continues to dot you up. I think that's really what makes Raoni so good, right? But you saw in the Henry fight that Henry kept following up, right, with his combinations and putting volume out. And eventually, those counters, Raoni wasn't able to keep up with the volume that he needed to counter. And Henry started to take the fight over a little bit, right? I think it's going to be a little bit of a different story with Trevin Jones. I think that Trevin Jones likes to... He throws like one or two strikes at a time too often, and in those moments, I think that's where Raoni's really going to dot him up because Raoni strings combos together, right? And I think he's going to have a little bit of a speed advantage. One thing you cannot discount is the power of Trevin Jones, right? Obviously, he's knocked guys out, but another thing to think about, a successful avenue for Trevin Jones might be to start pushing this up against the cage so that he can start wearing on the arms of Raoni Barcelos. And if you look at Trevin Jones's previous fights, he has attempted to do that, right? And they talk all the time about his jiu-jitsu experience and how many he's competed in like over 100 jiu-jitsu competitions. Like he feels comfortable grappling there. So, and I don't think he should go to the ground or attempt to go to the ground. I think takedowns are going to be tough to get against Raoni. I think that they're going to, once you get there, he's going to have an advantage once you're actually on the ground. But simply pushing this fight up against the cage and wearing on Raoni in those situations could be advantageous for Jones. And he might be slightly more like, I don't know, he might be more willing to do that because I think when he starts standing in the center and Raoni keeps throwing combinations and he's hitting you with all these different kicks and he's working the insides of your legs, right? Another thing I didn't mention about Sodiq Yusuff earlier, how he's great at leg kicks, right? He mixes his leg kicks in very well, and the timing on them is immaculate. But same with Raoni Barcelos, right? Raoni Barcelos will attack the legs, he'll bring the front kick to the body, and I just think that he's constantly going to be putting a work rate out that Trevin Jones isn't able to keep up with. And like I said, Jones throwing 1 to 2 strikes at a time, I think gets him in trouble because I think Raoni is going to constantly be pressuring forward. I just like Raoni to stay on the offense for most of this. And I think that, like I said, path to victory for Trevin Jones is maybe he catches Raoni with something because he can't deny his power, or he tries to push this fight up against the cage and wear on Raoni and then maybe start getting into more of a stand-up battle as the fight wears on if he can burn Raoni out a little bit defending against the cage. But I like Raoni to be the one on the offensive. I like him to be the one pushing forward. I like him drawing responses out of Jones, getting to the takedown when he wants to, and then, just stringing combinations together. I think that's going to be the real difference maker is that the strikes from Raoni come in bunches, whereas with Jones feels a little more like 1 or 2 at a time, right? And I think that this is a very advantageous fight for Raoni Barcelos. I got him by decision. I think this is still I think Jones is tough, but I think Raoni is going to be able to do what he needs to do to get the win in this one. All right, next, a welterweight matchup between Randy Brown and Francisco Trinaldo. And Trinaldo just feels like he's been around for forever, man. And he has been, but he's still dangerous, right? But against Randy Brown, I'm going with Brown. Man, Brown is young. I think that Brown is one of the guys who's a super talented athlete sitting outside of the top 15, but I think he has top 15 skill, right? His right hand is a fucking piston. If you look at the way he finished Alex Oliveira, cracked him with the right hand and then got around to the strangle, got around behind his back and rear naked choked him. Man, Randy Brown is a dangerous motherfucker. I don't like the hands down approach sometimes, right? And we've seen him get caught in situations where he's like, he has good head movement. Don't get me wrong. But there are moments where when his hands are down, he might hang out in the pocket too long. And if you do that against Trinaldo and he clips you, man, it could be a long night, right? Another possible problem for Brown could be if Trinaldo goes to the ground with him and gets top position. But I think that Randy Brown's jiu-jitsu and his length will be able to get Francisco Trinaldo off of him, and he'll be able to threaten with submissions and stuff like that. And while he might not get the submission finish, it's enough to get him back to his feet. And in a, ideally, Randy Brown wants to be on his feet hanging out at range in this fight, right? And never letting Trinaldo sort of invade that inside space. It's always the case with tall versus shorter fighters, obviously, but that's what Randy Brown has to do. And if he starts letting Trinaldo wear on him up against the cage, right, it could cause problems for him over time. Or if he can get in close and start cracking him and Randy Brown hangs out in the pocket too long with his hands down. I really wish he would, especially when he's moving and utilizing head movement, right? I really wish he'd keep his hands up a little bit more and be rolling with things up here, but fuck. What are you going to do? You can't change the dude's style, right? I still think Randy Brown wins this fight. I think he holds the range. I think the kicks are going to present a real problem for Trinaldo. I think that Randy Brown's constantly just going to be stabbing him in the gut with the front kick. And then I think the jab is going to open up the right hand. And it's just, Randy Brown and his reach, I think, give Trinaldo a lot of problems in this fight. All right, finally, we are at the main event between number 5 ranked Mackenzie Dern and number 6 ranked Xiaonan. Now, this is an interesting matchup, actually, because I think that Jan is going to have an advantage on the feet over Mackenzie. I think that she's just a little bit cleaner there, and she has really nice hand speed, and her striking is more compact and concise and technical than Mackenzie's. I think Mackenzie Dern has made a lot of progress. There's always all the talk about how she was working with Jason Perillo and stuff like that and how great she's gotten with her hands. And she looks much improved. But there's just something about somebody who has been clearly trained in striking for a long time. They're able to make those reads and capitalize on things. And Xiaonan likes to throw a lot of volume, right? The question is going to be, obviously, if she can keep somebody like Mackenzie Dern off of her and prevent the takedowns. Or even prevent Mackenzie Dern from doing something like pulling guard. Because if you saw the way she pulled guard against Tecia Torres, they were basically up against the cage and she still snaked around her body and ended up taking her back, going for knee bars and all this shit. Mackenzie Dern's jiu-jitsu is fucking special. But the knock on jiu-jitsu artists, and it's pretty true, is that they have a problem actually getting the fight to the ground, especially in MMA when you need to utilize takedowns. That's usually the most effective way to get it there. Not always, but most of the time, yeah, it's the most successful method, right? And the question is going to be, can Xiaonan stuff those takedown attempts and keep the fight on the feet? If so, I think she can fight a very technical and composed fight and beat Mackenzie Dern. But if she starts letting the fight get pushed up against the cage, right? Or she lets these chaotic scrambles happen, because Mackenzie Dern, another thing she'll do, if she'll throw big wild strikes and just leap at you to try to do anything to get this fight to where she wants it to be. And it's not a bad strategy. If you can create scrambles, sometimes you create opportunities that you can take advantage of. Man, I think I like Mackenzie Dern in this fight. I do think that her boxing will be good enough that she's going to present problems to Jan, right? And I think that the power is going to be a difference maker, right? While I do feel that Xiaonan is much more technical, like I said, much more precise, she's going to be much more compact, and the way she throws and withdraws her hands is just going to be smoother. But I think that Mackenzie Dern kind of brings that like I said, she's much better, but she's going to bring that kind of awkward style and power. And when that starts to connect on Xiaonan, I think it'll be enough of a difference maker that it will open up these takedown opportunities for Mackenzie Dern. And I think that Mackenzie Dern should be able to get the fight to the ground at some point. And when she does, I think there's a pretty large discrepancy there. Now, sometimes you see it's much harder to get submission finishes sometimes in MMA against people who can just defend and stay fundamentally sound. It'll be a question of whether Xiaonan can do that. But I feel that if Mackenzie gets it there, she should be able to get the finish. If Xiaonan is able to stuff takedowns and keep this on the feet, though, right? Even the big power shots of Mackenzie Dern, if they don't finish her, those will start to fade over time, and I think you'll see Xiaonan really pick up the volume. But I don't know. I think that Mackenzie's going to be able to get it done in this one, so we'll see. Like I said, I'm leaning pretty heavy on all the favorites, but let's go through and recap these real quick, and we'll wrap everything up. So, first, Mike Davis versus Slava Borschev. We should get a stand-up war in this one, but I like Mike Davis's ability and that option to mix things up if he needs to, and I think I just like the way he throws punches, right? I like how, like I said, he's very concise. I like his boxing style, his head movement. I got Mike Davis in this one, but Slava Borschev could definitely make something happen. John Castaneda, I got him winning over Daniel Santos, but don't count him out. Daniel Santos is a bad motherfucker, right? And if he can start marching John Castaneda down, cutting off the octagon and landing some of those power shots, he might be able to take this fight over. He's not afraid to like get into a fight with you. And he's going to try to make that happen against Castaneda. Overall, I like Castaneda's ability to move his head, mix in the wrestling, and just fight a well-rounded mixed martial arts fight though. Number 12 ranked Sodiq Yusuff, I think, is going to put a beat down on Don Shainis. I think he's going to do what he needs to do to get the newcomer out of there, right? Plain and simple. Raoni Barcelos versus Trevin Jones. I think Trevin Jones could make this fight interesting, one, because of his power, and two, because he could start to force things up against the cage. And like I said, slow the pace of the fight down and like kind of, bring it to where he wants to be and not where Raoni wants it to be. Overall, though, I think Raoni has too many weapons. I think his jiu-jitsu's too good. I think his striking's too good. He's very clean everywhere. I like him to win this fight. But just another bout that speaks to the depth of the bantamweight division. I got Randy Brown over Francisco Trinaldo. I like Brown to be able to, even if Trinaldo does get inside, I think he'll work out of those positions. And if it goes to the ground, I think Brown's length and his jiu-jitsu will get him off of his back at the very least, or at least use submission attempts to get back to his feet. I like Brown to hold the range, and I like him to hit Trinaldo with cleaner strikes than Trinaldo is going to be able to land. I think it's going to take a lot for Trinaldo to work his way inside. But if you see some of that hands down, showboating stuff from Randy Brown, Trinaldo could capitalize on shit like that. You got to be careful. And then I like Mackenzie Dern over number 6 ranked Xiaonan. I think that just Dern is going to have the ability, like I said, I think her hands are going to at some point open up opportunities for her to get to the ground. And when she gets there, it'll be a pretty big, there's going to be a pretty big gap in the skill set on the ground. And especially if Mackenzie can get there early, which I think she might be able to, because that's when her power is really going to matter. I think she can get Xiaonan out of there. If not, if this fight starts leaking into the second, third round, start getting a little more sweaty, you got to start your combinations that were working early. Now Xiaonan has reads on those, and then she starts mixing in her offense. Things could get very interesting after round 2. But I think Mackenzie might get this done inside of 2 rounds. Just my personal thought. I don't know. We'll fucking see. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate it as always. Let me know what you guys think of the fights down in the comments. Let me know what you think of the whole fucking Tua situation. What's going on with Bo Nickal? Is he ever going to fight Hamza? All that good shit. Let me know. I love reading the comments and shit. But thank you guys for tuning in. If you enjoyed, do me a favor. Hit the subscribe button. Give it a thumbs up. And I will catch you guys next time. I'll do an aftermath video after the fights this weekend. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.